Now, in the world of Jujutsu Kaisen, curse techniques are easily one of the most important aspects of a character. As Gojo himself says, it determines about 80% of your entire skill set as a sorcerer. The other 20% being made up by simple Shikigami, simple barrier techniques, cursed energy control, cursed energy reinforcement, and cursed energy blasts. Since cursed techniques are intrinsic to the sorcerer, meaning they're born with it already predetermined and it can't change, it means that for a lot of sorcerers, if you're born with a bad curse technique, you're essentially doomed. But throughout the story, we've seen that there's a lot more nuance in it than that. I think that in this series, there aren't many bad curse techniques, but rather that most of their wielders are bad. One of the greatest examples that comes to mind is when two people have the exact same curse technique, but to incredibly different results. This can be due to various amount of reasons, like having less cursed energy in general, or being able to output less of your cursed energy into your curse technique. It can also be affected by your mindset, which we'll get deeper into later in the video. Your knowledge of your own curse technique and Jujutsu itself is also a big factor. One of the final factors, in my opinion, is your creativity. In this video, I'm going to try and build a case for why I think that most curse techniques aren't really bad, but that the sorcerers themselves aren't maximizing the potential of their techniques. Please enjoy. The first one is fairly simple. As Gojo says in chapter 12, cursed energy is like electricity, and cursed techniques are like the appliances. As electricity powers your appliances, so does cursed energy power your cursed techniques. Meaning that if you have less cursed energy, or can output less cursed energy, the efficiency and power of your cursed technique will diminish as well. A great example of this would be Inumaki Toge and Okotsu Yuta. During Volume 0, Yuta copied Inumaki's inherited technique of cursed speech. Throughout the story, both in Volume 0 and in the main story, we get to see both Inumaki and Yuta make use of this technique. However, the results vastly differ. Cursed speech has a rule that the stronger the words used are, the worse the side effects are. So you would assume that Yuta's throat would also hurt a lot every time he uses the ability, yet it just doesn't. It could be due to one of two things. The first being the simple answer, that he just immediately heals the damage with reverse curse technique. Which is very plausible, but you'd at least expect him to actually take the damage first, and then proceed to heal it. The second, and the one that I personally think is more likely, is that Inumaki simply has less curse energy than Yuta, and thus the technique strains Inumaki more to accommodate. I especially think so after chapter 214, where we saw the effectiveness of Sukuna's cleave and dismantle drop tremendously when his cursed energy was being suppressed. It's not crazy to think that Inumaki has low cursed energy reserves either, as he was completely out of it during the Goodwill event after only having used the technique 5 times, and this while also having used cough syrup or a similar throat medicine in between. Another perfect example is how during the Shibuya incident, when Jogo and Hanami were using domain amplification to get their attacks to bypass the limitless, all Gojo had to do to beat it was to simply strengthen the limitless with more cursed energy. Thus, the disaster curses would have needed more cursed energy to strengthen the range of their domain amplification, which would in turn give them their sure hits again to bypass the infinity. But since they had less cursed energy than Gojo, they were unable to do this, basically showing that since Gojo had more cursed energy, he had a more effective curse technique and more effective Jujutsu in general, which ultimately means that you'll be a better sorcerer because of it. Mai Zenin is a perfect example of how a bad mindset can truly keep you back as a sorcerer. During the Perfect Preparations arc, when Mai is basically moments away from dying to her injuries from her father's brutal beating, she reveals to Maki that she basically never wanted to get stronger from the start. It's why she didn't leave the clan together with Maki and why her abilities were so limited despite the obvious heavenly restriction and twins being a bad omen rule in the verse. When she really put her mind to it and actually wanted to create something that could be considered impressive, she was able to create a replica of the Soul Liberation Blade that Toji Fushiguro used 12 years prior. She was even able to imprint some of her conscience into the blade, making it semi-sentient, as we see it making choices of its own during the fight with Maki, Daido, and Mio versus Cursed Naoya. Keep in mind that Mai was able to create this amazing special grade tool, all the while still being affected by heavenly restriction, the twins rule, and being incredibly weakened and wounded from her father. If she didn't have this many things holding her back, I could actually see her becoming something similar to Momoya Yorozu from My Hero Academia. But then far better, being able to just create anything she can imagine without needing to know the intricacies of how it works or how it's made. Kind of like Gremi from Bleach, but then not as insanely overpowered, obviously. Another example of a bad mindset holding back your curse technique within Jujutsu Kaisen would be Megami and his domain expansion. After the Kyoto Sister School Goodwill event, Megami has a talk with Satoru Gojo. During that conversation, he points out how someone like Yuji always goes for the home run in everything that he does, while Megami would rather go for the sacrificial bunt to ensure that his comrades can be successful. This bad mindset makes it that Megami, despite having the strongest sorcerer alive as his teacher, never actually asks him to train together. This then also affects Megami's ability to open his domain, as he was never able to imagine himself truly giving it his all, combined with the fact that since he never trained with Gojo, he also didn't understand how to enclose the barrier of his domain, which grants the sure hit effect. As soon as Megami switched his mindset slightly during the battle against the finger bearer of the Yasuhachi Bridge, he was able to temporarily open his domain and get a glimpse of how powerful he truly can be. Ever since then, his domain has been getting better and better, but he was yet to truly shift his mindset completely, as when his back was against the wall, he did not hesitate to sacrificially summon Mahoraga. The final example of how a bad mindset could hold you back comes in the form of a man known as Suguru Geto. During his school days, he and Satoru Gojo were known as the strongest together. They were partners that pushed each other to grow immensely. After the both of them failed their mission to protect Riko Amanai and complete the merger of Tengen with the Star Plasma Vessel, Geto started to blame the non-sorcerers for getting involved. He started to truly despise them in every way, which made him slowly descend into madness. While Gojo had his awakening during the Toji fight, Geto had the complete opposite, losing himself in his technique. He got sick of continuously consuming cursed spirits to help the non-sorcerers who didn't appreciate his suffering for them anyway. The final nail in the coffin was when Geto had his conversation with Yuki, and suddenly his mission shifted from becoming the strongest to eradicating all non-sorcerers. Years later, when Geto had his fight with Yuta, we see that in all that time he himself did not actually become a better sorcerer. Sure, he may have acquired more and stronger cursed spirits, but as a sorcerer, he did not grow. He didn't have access to reverse curse technique, which meant that as soon as Yuta blasted him with the Love Beam Cannon, he was done for. Unable to heal himself from the damage, he could only crawl away into an alley where he ultimately met his best friend again for one final confrontation. The theory of him not having reverse curse technique is solidified by the fact that as soon as Kenjaku got his hands on Geto's body, he was able to completely heal his body and all of the tissue that was scarred by Yuta, as well as restarting the heart of the body after death, similar to what Ryomen Sukuna did to Yuji. Another indicator that Geto's bad mindset made him not grow as a sorcerer was the fact that he didn't have a domain expansion. If he did, it would have been a much easier way to beat Yuta and Rika, who at that time did not have any actual way to counter domain techniques. Geto himself knew that Rika had the potential of unlimited power. He even says so himself and thinks that with Rika, he could actually take over the whole world. Gojo even confirms this when talking to the higher-ups, saying that he'd put his life on the line to exercise it if Rika ever went out of control. All this while Gojo is usually pretty cocky about being the strongest. So despite knowing all this, why would he still try to win a beam struggle with a maximum Uzumaki that was only running on a small portion of its power, since he had released a ton of his cursed spirits during the night parade of 100 demons, while his domain would have been far more effective? The only answer is that he didn't have a domain. Ryomen Sukuna even states that domains are the pinnacle of sorcery, implying that they're better than maximum techniques. Oh, and by the way, there's obviously the out-of-universe explanation that Gege Akutami hadn't thought of domain expansions yet. But I think that Geto simply not having a domain is also a great in-universe explanation, and it lines up perfectly with him not growing as a sorcerer after his mindset shifted to a far worse mindset. During the Hidden Inventory arc, Gojo admits that because he has an inherited technique, he basically had a set path to follow from the very start. This means that every time someone throughout history has a pair with the Limitless Six Eyes, their interpretation and usage of the technique was written down and passed on to the next generation to make use of. It can serve as a great guide to show how far your abilities can truly go, All that you'd need to do is work towards reaching those levels. Anytime that someone thinks of a new way of using the ability, that itself would also be noted and passed down to the next generation, while someone with a unique technique has to be very creative to find all the ways in which they could apply their curse technique, since there's no precedent on how it's used best. When Gojo was fighting the masked cloning curse user, we even see him trying to use curse technique reversal red multiple times to no avail before he had actually gained the understanding of reverse cursed energy. Basically showing that despite Gojo not yet having acquired the ability, he already knew of its existence, what it does, and how it should be applied in battle. This concept of inherited techniques being written down and studied throughout time isn't exclusive to the limitless 6 eyes either. Megumi Fushigero's 10 Shadows technique also had a similar guide to help him ascend to the next level with each different Shikigami. Many stories were also passed down within families, like how the leaders of the Gojo and Zenin clans were able to fight toe-to-toe with one another, or how so far not a single user of the 10 Shadows technique had managed to tame the divine General Mahoraga. Going back to the fight between Gojo and the masked cloning curse user, Gojo using the 6 eyes is able to instantly deduce what the abilities of his opponent are. After assessing them, he notes that it is a very powerful ability and that Jujutsu High could use a sorcerer with that technique. However, Gojo follows this up by saying that he believed the user themselves to be lackluster in putting the ability into practice during a fight. Perhaps the user just didn't have the knowledge of the heights of which the ability could go. After all, if you had a brand new military grade helicopter, but you didn't even know how to turn it on, you're still not gonna get very far, are you? Another example of knowledge being a heavy factor is how Kenjaku taught the disaster curses everything they know about barrier techniques. He taught them how to set up curtains and how to properly make use of domain amplification. Without having prior knowledge fed to you, you would have to keep experimenting with your abilities on what is and isn't possible. We even see Mahito doing this during his fights. The only difference being that Mahito was a prodigy amongst prodigies, yet even he didn't know that idle transfiguration could be used on Tengen's barriers to transfigure people remotely in fights. Something similar happens to Hiromi Higuruma. He gains his abilities after being awakened as a sorcerer for the Culling Games. Within a short span of time, he was able to figure out how to use a sure hit domain expansion, and from there, he reverse engineered how his curse technique works outside of the domain. Doing this, he's easily able to reach the level of strength of a seasoned grade 1 sorcerer. Perhaps if he had prior knowledge of Jujutsu, that he might have been able to create a sure hit sure kill domain, instead of only having a sure hit domain. Higuruma is also very lucky that the opponents he had faced before Yuji were all relatively easy. See, because Higuruma doesn't have much actual knowledge about Jujutsu, he probably doesn't know that the sure hit of your domain goes away during a clash of 2 or more domain techniques. This means that if he had faced anyone with a domain of their own, or a simple domain, or a hollow wicker basket, they would have likely been able to bypass the sure hit of Higuruma's domain, which states that there shall be no violence during the court session. Things like this are really small details that can make a huge difference in a fight, and you just have to know it, otherwise you're basically giving away free wins. Now, when it comes to creativity, this is something that can vastly differ per person. Obviously, some people simply are more creative than others. However, if you don't have an inherited technique, you have to be creative in some way to up your effectiveness in battle. Even Meimei, after having reached her physical peak and the limits of her curse technique, was able to become stronger by coming up with a creative solution to bypass the fact that her crows are really weak. I think that even those with inherited techniques have so much room to grow when it comes to their creativity. In Dragon Ball Super's Tournament of Power arc, Goku sets tiny keyballs on the floor. These act as landmines, and whenever someone steps on them, they go off. Someone like Gojo, who has already shown that he can control the standard position of his curse technique lapse, aka blue, and move it along a straight or curved line, could do something similar. He could set up a blue trap under the ground, and it would suck his unknowing opponent in as soon as they step over it. Or a red trap on the ground that went off like a landmine as soon as you stepped on or near it. Or think of a hollow purple that orbits himself instead of just shooting it off in a straight line. I'm just spitballing here, as I have no idea if these things are even possible. but it could very well be a creative way for even the strongest himself to become even more effective in battle. Sometimes creativity can be really simple, yet create entirely new solutions in your strategy to give yourself the upper hand in battle. When Megumi was fighting Reggie, Megumi came up with creative ways of using the 10 Shadows technique to his advantage, which led Reggie to forget that the Divine Dog Totality was already summoned, which ultimately paved the path for Megumi's victory. I often also think of the fight between Curse Naoya and Noritoshi Kamo. Noritoshi doesn't have reverse curse technique, so he can't endlessly waste his own blood like Choso can. This is because Choso, as a half cursed spirit hybrid, is able to heal with regular cursed energy and replenish his lost blood. Noritoshi, however, came up with the creative solution of circulating all of his blood that he's using in battle back into his body. By essentially extending the range of his vascular system, he can use far bigger and stronger attacks than that he'd normally be able to. While I already talked about Suguru Geto and his bad mindset earlier, I think that he's a combination of multiple factors if I'm being honest. He doesn't have an inherited technique, and thus he had to figure out everything on his own. After he switched mindsets, he stopped growing as a sorcerer, which means that he had less interest in using his technique in creative ways to get stronger. The result of this is that when Kenjaku takes over his body, he's able to figure out how to use a compressed and condensed form of the maximum Uzumaki. In its miniature state, it doesn't take as much cursed spirits to create powerful blasts. It can be used a lot quicker in terms of activation time, but also in terms of using it in rapid succession. Lastly, another benefit is that you can conceal the mini Uzumakis and catch people off guard like what happened to Yuki. It's a case of how a small bit of growth would have gone a long way for Geto had he achieved that level of sorcery. Now, obviously Kenjaku is better than Geto because he has multiple techniques and also just has a lot more cursed energy, as he's able to amplify the strength of fodder curses and crush Choso with them, something that Geto wasn't shown to be able to do with such speed and power. But despite that, I think that Geto really did have a chance to grow a lot further had so many things not held him back. Similarly, there are plenty of other sorcerers who fall into multiple categories of why they aren't maximizing the usage of their techniques. Now that we've discussed a few of the reasons of which your curse technique can be held back, I want to go over a few of the techniques in the series that I think are being used horribly, or techniques that just have a lot more potential than what has been shown so far. I won't cover Mai, since we already talked about how strong her technique actually is without its restrictions. Starting off the list, we have Momo Nishimiya's tool manipulation curse technique. This technique, in essence, is just that Momo is able to telekinetically move tools through the air. It's even powerful enough that her broom is able to carry her own weight through the air at pretty decent speeds. The tool in question also gains a boost in power, as a regular broom would never be able to create the large gusts of wind that Momo can create. I think that a different way that this technique could have been used is to mark special grade tools instead of her regular broom. In Volume 0, we were shown that if you quickly channel too much cursed energy into non-cursed tools, they can break under stress. If Momo, for starters, were using a special grade cursed tool, she could probably channel more cursed energy into it and accomplish a lot more in battle than she is now. Secondly, we haven't been specifically told if there's a limit to how many tools she can control at a time. Things that come to mind would be controlling multiple metal chains to trap your opponents in place, or whip them with the chains. Another idea would be to have multiple special grade tools flying around, kind of like Penny from Ruby. Imagine how OP she could be if she had an inverted spear of heaven, a playful cloud, and a soul liberation blade flying around attacking you from different angles while she was still free to move around herself. The second person that I want to talk about was Junpei. Now with Junpei, many people think that his poison curse technique is kinda weak. It's said that he specifically needs his Shikigami to make use of the poison. However, in this scene where Junpei attacks his school, it looks like his poison is spreading virally through the air without him or his Shikigami touching them. Yuji took Gojo's advice of targeting the Shikigami user to end the fight a lot quicker, and thus we didn't really get to see all what Junpei could actually do. But the fact is that Junpei only had his ability for about a day at best. The only reason why his poison didn't do anything to Yuji is because he was housing Sukuna, who just so happens to be the king of poisons. Talk about bad luck, huh? Before we even get to see Junpei grow his ability, he's already killed off by Mahito. Despite all this, he grew his Shikigami tremendously within a day, and when he started attacking the students and faculty at his high school, Junpei's poison seems to be even more effective than that of the special grade cursed spirits, Kechisu and Esso's rot techniques. Although you could argue that that is because Nobara is defending her body with cursed energy, while Junpei's schoolmates were not. Either way, for only having had the ability for a day, he already had a great showing, and I think that if he had survived, he would have become a fearsome fighter, maybe even developing a domain where the air is poisonous. So despite you having an anti-domain technique, you'd still get hurt, leaving you unable to reverse curse heal yourself efficiently. This would be similar to Jogo's domain, where even just entering it would cook you from the heat, despite that not being a sure hit technique. Another technique that I think is incredibly underutilized would be Kirara's Love Rendezvous curse technique. During their fight against Megumi and Panda, we mainly see the technique being used defensively to stop anyone from reaching Hakare's office. However, if you tag certain objects like knives or swords with the same star as your opponent, they would go flying at them. Kirara doesn't even need to touch you directly for this to take effect. If they touch your cursed energy, you can also get tagged as well. We know from the first arc where Nanami and Yuji were tracking down Mahito that cursed energy residue is naturally left behind by a lot of sorcerers and cursed spirits. So basically, Kirara can touch the residue left behind from where you once stood and trigger the ability. I could imagine a funny scenario in a fight between Kirara and Kashimo where Kashimo is building up a lightning charge by marking Kirara with its cursed energy. All Kirara would have to do is mark Kashimo's cursed energy, and the sure hit lightning would just reverse and hit Kashimo instead. All the while Kashimo not being able to actually approach Kirara unless he figures out the pathing that he's supposed to take. But as soon as he does, Kirara could just switch the positions of the markings again. Similar to how the Rabbit Escape Shikigami, a usually harmless Shikigami, was almost able to crush Megumi entirely. I think that if Kirara used their ability offensively to just mark a bunch of buildings, those buildings would come flying at you, and since you're the center of mass, you'd be unable to escape it even if you survived getting crushed, kind of like Chibaku Tensei from Naruto. Do this enough times, and you could eventually close off someone's access to air. Reasons like this is why I think the technique could be extremely fearsome, but we just haven't seen it yet. I talked about this one in a previous video, but Boogie Woogie could theoretically swap out individual organs in your body during Toto's domain. Similar to how Naoya's projection sorcery was able to target individual cells at once instead of a whole person within his domain. This way, his technique could become even more potent than it already is, giving him far more ammo in 1v1 fights instead of Boogie Woogie working best in scenarios with more than 2 people. If the current injured Toto can open his domain without his hands, then he'd be able to use his technique again since it would become a sure hit sure kill without him needing to clap. Some people find Ogami's seance technique to be lackluster, but it actually has mad potential. Since she can summon the body or the soul's information to herself or a willing participant and transform them into that deceased person, you basically have unlimited potential to what you can do with it. Imagine her summoning into a previous Limitless 6 Eyes user, or transforming into the human Sukuna before he died and became a curse. She just so happened to pick the wrong person when she chose Toji, since his heavenly restriction broke him free of the spell which was casted using cursed energy. I guess a downside would be that you'd have to actually know the circumstances of who you're summoning, or you'd risk it backfiring on you. But this can be avoided by simply doing more research on your targets before you summon them. Even Nanako's camera technique has some potential to it. We've seen her be able to teleport anyone and even damage others with it. We don't exactly know how it works, and we also know that Nanako doesn't have that much cursed energy since her techniques are pretty weak and they drain her really quickly. However, in the hands of a smart sorcerer with a lot of cursed energy, I could see it being applied really creatively. Think of someone having 100 phones and linking all of their cameras together via Zoom call. You can set the phones up in a bunch of different places, like how Minato from Naruto can teleport to anywhere that he has set a kunai with his markings. Or Nanako could use the linked cameras to fight someone from long distance, as long as the phones have enough battery. Obviously, someone like Nobara would be a counter to this, since if she finds even a single phone, she could strike her opponent back just as hard. But she's sort of an exception, not the rule. Arata Nita has a curse technique that allows him to stop the bleeding of wounds and act like a painkiller numbing medicine. If he acquired reverse curse technique and reversed his power, it could be a technique that opens his wounds easily and adds extra unbearable amounts of pain to each punch. It would be similar to Kenjaku taking the anti-gravity system curse technique, reversing it, and turning it into a very offensively powerful gravity technique. I do think that there are some genuinely bad techniques like Remi's technique that allows her to control her hair. I don't really see how someone like that could become more powerful aside from like making the hair faster or giving it better piercing strength, but its lack of hacks and versatility would still make it kind of bad. The same goes for Mimiko's noose technique that was only really able to eliminate non-sorcerers. I don't really see any ways for a technique like that to grow, but if you do, then please let me know. So yes, in conclusion, while I do think that there are some genuinely bad techniques out there, the truth is that most techniques that we've seen in the series are not being used to their maximum potential, and that's fully on the sorcerers not being good enough. The fact that it theoretically should be possible for all techniques to have a curse technique reversal, a curse technique lapse, and a maximum technique, yet we barely ever see anyone with the ability to make use of all three in battle, is proof in and of itself that the techniques aren't being used to their maximum potential. That's just some food for thought though. There are certain techniques that we literally have not seen anything of, like Utahime's singing technique, Chizuru Hari's claws technique, and Ichichi's curse technique, but since a lot of them were skipped over, we can just assume that Gege didn't think that their techniques were substantial enough to show anyway. We just know that they have curse techniques and that they do something, the specifics of which aren't relevant to the story. One could argue that those sorcerers are just bad at using their techniques, and that is the reason why the author didn't feel like wasting panels to show it. In chapter 212, Ichichi himself even confirms that he's just a horrible sorcerer as he reminisces on how Gojo saved him from dying needlessly in the field from being a bad sorcerer. I hope that with this video I was able to create some thoughts going in your head about how the truth is that most curse techniques aren't actually bad. If you have some other points that you'd like to add on to this discussion, please feel free to do so in the comment section down below. If you like this type of content, please be sure to comment, like, subscribe. Your support is always much appreciated. See ya!